Great. So today is the Advancing Racial Equity in Municipal Clean Energy training. We've got some really fabulous speakers today, and before I hand it over to them to introduce themselves, I wanted to just kind of set the stage for why we are talking about this in our Municipal Clean Energy Training Academy. I know that up until this point, the trainings have been more technical focused or power skills focused. So um, wanted to shed a little light of like what our thinking was behind bringing our awesome partners from Race Forward for this training. So um, I know that many or most of us came into this work thinking about because we care about clean energy or climate action or reducing emissions and energy affordability. And maybe at first glance, racial equity may seem like a separate topic or a separate issue from those goals, but I think as we all know, local government is all very deeply connected. And public policies and investments and the things that we are all working on affect communities in different ways. And those decisions or the decisions about who the program benefits and whose voices are included in the public planning processes help to shape those outcomes. Um, and we wanted to have this discussion as municipal staff to think about how we're making those choices and who is influencing those decisions. Um, And really just seeing today's session as an opportunity to learn about practical tools and ask questions and think about how equity can be integrated into the work that we're all already doing, not as like an add-on check the box, but really like integrating it into the work that we do and making it an effective and durable process. So I will introduce our speakers in a second. You can go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to say that we are so excited to have Race Forward join us for this conversation, and I participated in a REACH training, REACH's Racial Equity Advancement and Collaborative Hub that MAPC put together with Race Forward, and saw Tony speak and could listen to Tony talk forever. This was like a day-long training over the course of many months, and reached back out to Race Forward and I said, "Can you do this 8 month long training in 90 minutes?" And they said, "No, but we'll do our best." Um, so we're just so grateful for them and excited to help have them guide this conversation and learn alongside all of you. So um, next slide, please.
Are you able to see the interpolls?
No,
Seems strange. It's on my screen.
let me try taking over. It's been a tech issues day.
I will pause recording. Do you want to take the screen, Julia?
Searching lesson question. Thank you. So what we're covering today is how can we use a systems level analysis of racism across individual, interpersonal, institutional, and structural levels to identify specific leverage points where your department, planning department, facilities, et cetera's policies, programs, and practices can advance racial equity in the communities that we serve. So learning objectives, including understanding the history of racism and the role of government in the United States, and gaining a shared understanding of these different definitions and concepts that are essential to normalizing and promoting institutional and systemic racial equity. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our fabulous speakers. I know you guys have your own intro slides, so I can stop sharing and ask you to share. And just thank you so much again for leading this conversation.
All right, awesome. So I'll start off if you don't mind, Dan. Could you stop sharing just for a second?
Yes.
All right, because I want to make sure everyone sees me. And so we get ready to talk about race, a lot of analytics about race, about a lot of understanding about race. But I do want to say this here that communication, the optic lens is like 80% of how human beings communicate. And so this session is going to be extremely interactive. And to get the most of it, we are going to ask you, if all possible, let us see who you are, right? Like I can see names, but I know me, I thrive off of my optic lens. And so if you could, spruce up a little bit, get your hair did, cut your cameras on so I can see your gorgeous smiles. If you cannot, we are going to have a level of accountability. Go ahead and put it in the chat why you can't. Of course, obviously, the person that's on a cell phone, that would be a little hard, and we don't want you to take any unnecessary risk if you happen to be mobile. But we're going to really try to get into and really invest ourselves. Great. And we are going to be using a lot of tech. So we're watching the actual chat. If you feel like you want to, because we're going to be asking some questions, feel free to use the raise hand icon. And if some of you are super savvy, you can raise your hand and your Zoom might take it over if you got that enabled. Okay. And so we want to start off really with just a brief introduction. My name is Tony Patillo. I am coming from the Piscataway lands of Baltimore, Maryland. That's where I was born. That's where I was raised, but I spent 30 years in North Carolina, working in local, state, and federal government affairs, as well as the healthcare industry. I actually started my work as a diversity agent and really started understanding that diversity will only take you but so far. And so I was part of a core racial equity team in the early 2000s under Race Forward as a contractor for Charlotte, North Carolina. And so at the time, I was managing the emergency medical service system. And we really, at that time, thought that we were the number one outcomes for cardiac arrest survival rates out of the hospital until we put a racial equity lens on it. And so we were getting all kinds of accolades across the country. And then when we finally put that analysis on, what we found was Hispanic or Latino men and African American men above the age of 55 living in particular zip codes were twice as likely to die from cardiac arrest out of the hospital with the same comorbidities as all other counterparts in their demographic group. And so the importance of being able to analyze things from a racial equity perspective is because race is the number one driver for outcomes in the United States, right? And, I used to say from birth to death, but I had to change that to pre-birth to afterlife. Reason being, if you look at maternal mortality rates, you can see that like there's an impact before children are even born. And then if you do research and study across the country where and how we actually bury our dead, there's disparities there too. And so I had to really change my vocabulary and say, oh, wow, this is pre-birth to afterlife, right? Race is the number one driver. The last thing I want to say about that, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dan, is to just understand that race is a social construct as we go into this work, right? Like there is no scientific attachment to race. It is really man created it. The key question is, as we step into these sessions, we got to begin to say, well, why did man create it? Right. And so we're going to try to unpack just a little bit of that for you all today as it applies to your work. So, Dan, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tony. My name's Dan. I use he, him pronouns. I am happy to be here. I'm a white American male. I live in the Twin Cities, which is the land of the Dakota and the Ojibwe. I was born and raised in Minnesota. I love Minnesota. I'm still in Minnesota. I visited Boston a couple of times, and I hold it. There's a good spot in my heart for Boston. So I grew up in upper middle class in primarily white cities. So middle school, high school, college, all primarily white. I was first politicized in college in the early years in the nonprofit sector. And in particular, I like to mention like the first intro to race and ethnic studies class that I took in college, which was like a senior year course for me. Felt like a slap in the face or a punch in the gut. I had to reckon with privilege and examine many of the like things that I had taken for granted in life. In hindsight, it felt very late, but it also like led me to a core belief, which is that this work is accessible to folks at any point in their life. So that's kind of why I share that. I started out in affordable housing in the Twin Cities, where I saw racial disparities in housing, then went to a capacity building nonprofit where we saw racial disparities and access to capital for nonprofits. And now I'm at Race Forward and GARE, where our mission is to catalyze the movement towards a more equitable and just multiracial democracy, which is lovely. And at GARE, we are working to advance racial equity in government, which is predicated on the belief that race shouldn't be a determinant of life outcomes. And to Tony's point, it's not just life outcomes, right? Pre-birth to after death. I've been a facilitator and educator for about a decade. Love this work and looking forward to spending the day with each of you. And so without further ado, I think we're just going to dive into our learning environment. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but what we're trying to do is just set a container for a good conversation today. So we're all here by choice. Take space, make space, which means like, please share and participate and try not to dominate the discussion. We're trying to learn collectively. This is recorded. Be present here. Let's listen with the intent to understand, offer what you can, ask for what you need, and let's have one chat. Any questions about these? Can I get a thumbs up or a green sign or an emoji reaction if this all sounds good to folks? All right, looking good. All right, then we're going to ask a couple of questions. Feel free to, we're going to reflect on it a bit, and then we'll either drop it in the chat or come off on mute. We're going to ask about early experiences with differences. So the questions are, how diverse was your neighborhood growing up? And when or how did you first realize that people were treated differently in society based on personal characteristics?
Dan, did you want us to?
Government, why are we here in the role of government? I want to read a statement, and I want you all to think about it, and then tell me, do you agree, disagree? Like, what about it? What's capturing your imagination about this statement? Now yeah, there we go. So a government that is in power has the ability to shape the views of the population it governs by putting out narratives, passing laws, instituting policies, and establishing procedures. What do you all think about that? How powerful is government? Again, you can put it in the chat, you raise your hand, because we're going to make this interactive. What do y'all think about that? True, absolutely. Right. Right. Our government has a lot of power, right? And so our government really establishes the rules. Our government like sets the tone, establishes the boundaries and the laws. Is that Kai? Kai, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I agree with this, but I guess I would also go beyond just the ability to shape views, but also to shape the actual reality of the population. And
Absolutely.
that's for the good, for the better or for the worse.
Right. And Kate, that's a very interesting comment that you made, right? There has to be a level of belief in it. And so if we all have been, and it's funny because some of the language that is being used by opposition to the work is like, we don't want our children, indoctrinated. Well, but the reality of it, we all have been indoctrinated, right? When you really think about it. When you look at the American education system, and if you usually when people come here to the United States or move to the United States from other countries, even ones that you would think were very racialized, there's a constant narrative that they didn't really experience racism until they came to the United States, right? So we got to really start to really unpack some of that, and our government plays a big role in that. And so I want to say this, that we have always been since the founding and this experiment of the United States of America, we've always been a nation of values, right? Even now, as challenging as things are now, the world still looks to the United States and says, what say you, right? Like, what is your value on events that are happening on a global scale? Everything from global warming to human rights issues. And so what we really need to understand is there's a difference between values, like Kyle, like you were saying, like, and the live reality. Government can create reality, right? And so we want to examine some of these realities of our government. And so I want to be able to make this interactive. So we're going to put up a actual statement that comes from a famous document. If you know what the document is, and we're going to do like Jeopardy. If you know it, just go ahead and come off mic, and we're just going to have a interesting time with it, right? So here's the first one. All men are created equal. What document is that from, and who wrote it? And if you're real good, tell me what year. And you can Google. I don't care. That's not the point. All men are created equal. Where's that from? A couple of y'all sweating.
Not
It's
gonna
okay.
nail it. I'm not gonna nail it, but I'm feeling either the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution.
All right, let's see. There we go. Right? Written by Thomas Jefferson in 1776. Now, if I don't go any further than that, what's problematic about that statement? Think about the time it was written, who wrote it. What's problematic if we don't go any further?
Written by a slave owner.
Yeah, and Rebecca, I will tell you this because words matter, right? What we have changed that language to is the enslaved. Now they are very descriptive. You have to own that, right? Without causing harm to the other people. And so we use the term enslaver, right? But you're absolutely right. The other aspect of that is, and I thought you all would jump on this, like all men. Let's look at the quality of who's participating even here today, right? But were we even talking about all men?
It's
No.
under the assumption that it's all white men, right?
Go ahead and hit it, Dan. Yes,
Yeah.
Laura, you're absolutely right. But not even all white men, right? White men of property. But here's the interesting piece to this, because this is the foundation of the birth of our nation. And a nation, just like a house, is only as strong as the foundation it is built on. And so when you're looking at that, the government decided who could actually be created as equal, but not just that, but who was property and what was property. Right. And so when you think about it, the founding fathers of this nation never really considered that anyone other than white men of property would ever be a part of the participatory process of our government. Right. And so if we stopped sharing and we could see the whole group, and I said, OK, who would actually be considered in this actual statement, it wouldn't even be half of the people participating. Right. And so we got to begin to really think about that. Like, where did this come from? And I'm going to tie it in a minute. Let's go on to the next one, Dan, if you would. So here's our next statement. With liberty and justice for all. Where's that from? You know who wrote it, even if you know what year. With liberty and justice for all. Yeah, Pledge of Allegiance is in the chat, right? So that's the Pledge of Allegiance by Francis Bellamy in 1892, and then it has been edited several times after that because it didn't say United States of America and it didn't say under God. But here's the key question, and I want you to all think about it. Why did we need a Pledge of Allegiance? Right. And see, this is the challenging piece to understand our history. We can't just take it for face value. Like, we got to take it to the next level to try to unpack some of the true intentions of and the outcomes of decisions, laws, policies, and practices, because all of this plays into present day condition. So if we don't unpack it, we won't really understand like what the root cause of some of the issues are. Dan, you can click it. So the reason why was because we needed to have this definition of true Americanism, right? Because there was a rising tide of European, Southern and Eastern European immigrants coming to the United States that spoke differently. They brought their cultures with them. And I want you to look at that last quote right there: races which cannot assimilate without lowering our racial standard. Right. And the reason why I think that statement, that was from a member of Congress, but the reason why I think that statement is so relevant today, because we just heard at the highest level, even as short as last year, that we're having the poisoning of our blood. I don't know if you all remember that statement that was made, right? But we don't know history. We're likely to repeat it. And then the sad thing is, if you look at American history, we have a habit of repeating some of these things, right? And so really understand that. And I want to ask, for those of you, how many of you all can trace your lineage to a European country that was non-English speaking? I know a couple of you all said Germany, right? Just put in the chat, like, where, right? Whether it's Germany, Italy, wherever, a European country that was non-English speaking. Norway, France, Ireland. So let me start asking some questions. Do you speak German? Do you speak French? Why not? You came from you know your family came from a European country that spoke a different language. Why are you not speaking the language? Why are you not bilingual? Anybody got a thought on that, Laura? I see you coming off
Yeah.
mic.
Yeah, well, it's been too long. It was too long ago, so my ancestors became assimilated, just like you said would happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that, the assimilation pressures, right, on your ancestors,
Yeah.
right? Like because there was this invention of whiteness, and if you were willing to trade in your cultural identity to join a bigger group, there were benefits to that, right? And even now there are people who come to United States in 2026, and they not only change their names to sound more English sounding, but they will change their children's names. Right. And so there was a benefit to whiteness. But this is why I say that racism hurts all of us, because there's so much richness in all of our cultures and identities. And our ancestors, well, somewhat, mine was taken, but our ancestors as a whole collectively traded that in for whiteness. Right. And that I think that is, like, we don't get that particular piece of, be able to see the value of it, right? And there was something that was lost. There's something that continues to be lost when we say, leave your primary identity at the door. But this is our government that is actually establishing this. Dan, you can go to the next one. Thank you. This is the last one. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish the earth. Looks familiar, right? There we go. Gettysburg Address, written by Abraham Lincoln, 1863. What's going on around this time? Civil War. Yeah, and actually, I want you all to understand this. Look at this last bullet point. During the exact same time, Congress abolished slavery in the District of Columbia by compensating the enslavers, right? And offering support for those who were free to immigrate to the West Indies. But by compensating the enslavers, that's another form of reparations. It's just we're paying the wrong people, right? And so when I had those conversations around, oh, we're talking about reparations. We've never done this before. This is how we're going to do it. Like, oh no, we have done it. We've done it multiple times, but really understand that there's a difference between values and realities. Why do we need to know this? That's part of our analysis, right? Because as you go into communities, sure, I can guarantee you right now, you can go on anybody's website from any town, city, state in the United States of America, and it's going to sound beautiful. right? We strive that all people can thrive in our community. That's a great statement. That's a great value to have. Racial equity work is all about, okay, let's look at your values and let's look at the realities and the outcomes. All people are not thriving, right? All people are not created equal, in the sense of outcomes. And so that's one of the reasons why we want to lock into this. Dan, you can move to the next slide. So our government really has these three big buckets of actually, I'm gonna say 3.5, and I'll explain that in the end. Our government actually established this whole thing around race and was very explicit about not just creating, but also maintaining racial inequity. That's why you would see, who had the right to vote, who could have property, who could get married. Like all of these things were established by our government through laws, policies, and practices. But we learn as a nation, we like to think that we get better. So we moved into this place where we became, racially implicit, right? So it's not obvious, not as obvious. You have race neutral policies. The challenge to that is when you have these race neutral policies and you are not none of your analysis is based off of race or based off of the needs, you actually can, and in a lot of instances, have caused more harm. The biggest one I can give you in this one would be the 1994 Crime Bill Act, right? Written by a Democratic president, signed off by a Democratic Congress, a Democratic House, as well as some of the top Black and brown leaders of the time, all signing off on it. Good intentions, but the impact of that was, and still is, that more Black and brown men have been placed in prison since that period than any other time in U.S. history combined. Right. And so we have to be able to move past the intention. We had good intentions. No, let's measure what the outcome is. But this next phase is when we have a period where the government said, we need to start looking at things through a racial equity lens. Right. We need to actually bring to life and bring into our organizations the attempt to advance racial equity, to understand that we need to embed this in our work. And so a lot of this work started off in Seattle, Washington, and it progressed throughout the country. And henceforth, you have Race Forward and CARE. But the other piece to that is that without this analysis, without using racial equity, we're missing the whole piece of the outcomes, right? Outcomes by race, outcomes by, your intersectionality of your demographics, your immigration status, your economic status, your gender, your like all these different components. And like until we start actually getting good at that piece of it, we're never going to have that ultimate goal of equity throughout our society and racial justice. You can leave it here, Dan. What we don't have on here is our present day condition, right? Because when you look at it, and I will say this, every time, if you look at our history, every time you push against power, power is going to push back, right? And so we're in a period now where we cannot, there's certain things, especially on the federal level, that some things have been stripped either through financial disadvantages or through actual policy, right? And so this administration has come in and said, no, we're going to stop DEI. We're going to stop racial equity. They got a whole definition of terms that are triggers for the federal government. And so we're at we're at a pinch point, right? Like, what are we going to do? And what I like to say to people as individuals is, imagine with what you know now. Imagine that you were in one of these other periods, particularly the first two on the left, right? So you were in that first period. Would you have been an enslaver, knowing what you know now, right? Would you have been an abolitionist? Like, place yourself in that situation. Stopping people from crossing over the bridge? Would you have been a fireman actually pointing the hose, knowing what you know now? The reason why I'm asking that is this is our moment. This is our moment, right? We had our ancestors who made choices of what side of history they were going to be on. What are we going to do? Right? We have to begin to think about that. Okay, Dan, you can go to the next one. So what do we mean about racial equity? It's really simple, right? Racial equity is about closing the gap so that race is no longer a determinant, the primary determinant of one's success. The key thing to it, and this is for me, this is what makes it stick, and this is what helps to reach other people. The ultimate goal is improving outcomes and conditions for all people, right? Because usually when there's a racial equity, some type of race-driven initiative, some of the common language is, oh, I'm just going to sit back because I think that's for those people. Right. But no, it's really for all of us. Right. But we have to be able to see what's our skin in the game. And so in order to do that, we have to come up with real targeted strategies that focus on improving conditions for those that are worse off. And then we got to move beyond the transactional pieces of just providing services and really focus on institutional and policy and structural change. Okay. Dan, you go to the next one. So again, what's this race and framework, right? If race is the number one determinant, we know that there are other impacts. And I'll ask you all this. We talked about identities that actually determine outcomes. What are some of the other identities that you all are carrying and that your communities are carrying, people that you know are carrying? What are some of the other identities beyond race? Again, you can use the chat, you can come off mute. Class, immigrant status, religion, gender, socioeconomic status, age, ability. Right. And so that's why we have to use a race and framework, because we know for a fact that this is like the intersectionality of how all of these different identities can layer forms of oppression, but also forms of privilege as well, too. Dan, you can click through. Right. And I want to talk about this particular piece here, right? The race and environment. And all the social scientists will tell you that it is environment that creates behavior, not behavior that creates environment. Why is that important to know? Because a lot of times when we are starting to do some of this work, the natural energy gravitates towards individualism, right? Like this person is in this situation because they failed to do this or because they did this. But we also have to be able to address the environment. And I'd like to use this analogy that imagine if you are living in your community, you have this gigantic pond that you walk around every morning. And then one day you walk past the pond and you see one fish dead in the water, belly up, right? Rebecca, you'll say, hey, what happened to the fish? Right? Pretty much. Then you come past maybe 2 weeks later, Laura, you come past, you see two fish. You're like, oh, what happened to the fish? But if you come past that pond the next week and you begin to see 100 fish belly up dead in that water, what's the next question you begin to ask? Anyone? Exactly. What's wrong with the pond? What's wrong with the water? Right? This is the water that we're living in. And this is the approach that we have to begin to look at it. Like, what's wrong with the water? What's wrong with the environment? What's wrong with the systems? What's wrong with the institutions that we're all operating in? Because I will say this here, that you can remove racism. If you had a magic pill and everybody took the pill, you could remove racism. The outcomes will more than likely still stay the same because the systems are operating on cruise control. Like, Kai, I don't know when you first came to work where you work at, but most of us, when we come into a job, we're given the rules. Right. We don't come in and from day one and say, how would you like things to be? Right. They give you a big packet and say, hey, follow these rules, do this. They usually attach you to somebody and say, we're going to be successful if you just follow our rules. That's how structural and institutional racism is working, is on cruise control. The ultimate goal of what we want to try to do is we want to move people, right? Because usually, people do attach themselves to the blame and shame, and a little bit of guilt and grievance, right? And harm. We want to shift from that to start looking at what's the cause and what's the effect of the cause, right? What is the systems, or what are the systems and solutions that are actually producing these outcomes? So we want to move away from this individual challenge of guilt and shame, who's a racist, to looking at what's actually causing the racial inequities. Same thing around intentions. Move away from what did they mean, what were their attitudes, to look at what were the actions and the impact of the actions themselves and the outcomes. Moving away from prejudice, who believes in what and what made them do it, to look at the system. What institutional policies, practices, and procedures are responsible for producing these inequities? And then the same thing with grievance, right? How can we fix what just happened, to what are the we begin to move upstream when it comes to these racial inequities that we are noticing in our systems and our actual everyday practices. Dan, you can keep going. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan, and he's going to talk to us about the different levels of racism.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So underscoring like what we're about to talk about is rooted in the approach that Tony just explained, which is that we're trying to shift the focus from individual to systemic. So focusing on those institutional and structural pieces. And what we're going to walk through is just the framework for understanding the different ways that we can think about that. So individual is both internalized and interpersonal, and then systemic is institutional and structural. So we will start with internalized racism. I'm going to ask folks to drop some examples in the chat. Internalized racism is a racism that lies within individuals. So these are private beliefs and biases about race that reside inside our own minds and bodies. So examples of this would be like prejudice, xenophobia, conscious and unconscious bias about race. An example for myself, I already mentioned my late politicization, but for white people, one of the ways that internalized racism shows up is internalized superiority or entitlement. So for example, growing up, I always assumed that I was going to college. It was never a question, and that may not be the case for other folks with marginalized identities. And I think for the sake of time, we are going to keep it moving. I'm going to ask again as we go through for folks to put examples in the chat. And then as we get into the structural, I might ask for folks to come off mute and talk about how it works in the energy sector. So interpersonal racism, this is like the classic when you think about racism and you think about racist, this is the racism that occurs between individuals. So this is bias, bigotry, discrimination based on race. So once we bring our private beliefs about race into our interactions with others, we're now in that interpersonal realm. So anybody think of examples of interpersonal racism? Might drop it in the chat. Microaggressions, classic example. Yeah. Yeah. Name calling, stereotypes that are brought into the interpersonal realm. What I'll typically share about this, and yeah, bad jokes. I'm not sure what screening means. Wondering if somebody could mic up and clarify.
Hi, that was mine. I kind of meant along the lines of gatekeeping or reluctance to hire people, which I also see in the chat, or maybe reluctance to have relationships or friendships or things with other people.
Yeah, great example. Okay, so I'm with you. That one's interesting because that one is right on the cusp of interpersonal and institutional. So when another example that we'll kind of talk about in this realm is like, let's say you have like a hiring manager, and their interpersonal racial bias and discrimination comes into play when they're functioning in an institutional capacity. That's this like it hits both the interpersonal and institutional racism levels. And then I'm going to take a swing at some of the like energy examples, backing up to internalized racism. Um, if we're thinking about somebody that's like, say, a resident from a historically disinvested neighborhood, is assuming that renewable energy programs like rooftop solar or other energy efficiency grants are like not for people like us. Um, and it's a when that is racial in nature, then we call it internalized racism. But just like Tony talked about earlier, we use the race and framework. So it's race and um, neighborhood or red line district or socioeconomic status or any of those sorts of things. Then we move on to the interpersonal. Um, Another way that this could look like in the energy realm is, let's say there's a utility representative that spends more time explaining renewable energy financing options to white homeowners than to homeowners of color because of unconscious assumptions about financial, well, it could be conscious or unconscious assumptions about financial literacy or creditworthiness. Um, Great. And we've got scapegoating or eagerness to have friendships, but not committed or deep. Yeah, so that's another example of interpersonal. Then we'll get into institutional. So this is the racism that occurs within institutions. So it involves unjust policies, practices, procedures, and outcomes that work better for white people than people of color, whether intentional or not. And so this is also what Tony was talking about, right? We have those race neutral policies that don't consider race or aggregate or disaggregate data by race and other demographics. That's what we mean by like whether it's intentional or not. So examples of this, like a school district that concentrates students of color in the most overcrowded, underfunded schools with the least experienced teachers. Wondering if we can crowdsource an example from the room about something related to, energy or utilities. That would be institutional racism. So a policy, practice, procedure. The Mass Save participation rates. So I'm not familiar with the Mass Save program, but I'm assuming that it's like a financial incentive or reward program, and the folks that participate in that program that receive the rebate or the refund or the benefit are primarily white residents or come from neighborhoods that are primarily white. Then we've got where data centers are located, polluting power plants in disadvantaged neighborhoods, and right, who is most likely to live in those disadvantaged neighborhoods, or even, were those neighborhoods historically redlined, or do they have racial covenants within property adjacent to those disadvantaged neighborhoods where the power plants are located? That's forcing, Black or people of color to not live in those neighborhoods that are safe or farther away from those power plants. Yeah, transportation access, translation. So right, we talked about very early on, do you still speak the language of your ancestors? So folks that do that and haven't learned English, that presents a barrier to access, and who's likely to be in that position. Great. All right, love what's happening in the chat, and I'm going to keep us moving for the sake of time. Actually, I'm going to ask for a time check, Shamiksha, or
We have about 30 minutes left.
30 minutes left. We're trying to save 15 for Q&A, so we're trying to wrap by 40-ish. Great. Okay, so now we're going to talk about structural. So institutional and structural both fall into the systemic bucket. And the structural racism refers to racial inequities across institutions. So this is, across institutions, policies, social structures, history, and culture. So this is the one that's like, it's not specific to one thing. It's the compounding effect across time, across institution, across like individual bad actors within institutions. It's the there's a better way to say whole kit and caboodle, but that is what's coming to my head right now. So structural racism highlights how racism operates as a system of power with multiple interconnected, reinforcing, and self-perpetuating components. This is like what Tony said, right? Racism in institutions and structures is operating on cruise control. So it's the racial inequity that's deeply rooted and embedded in history and culture and our economic, political, and legal systems. So again, going to ask folks to drop in the chat, what are examples of structural racism connected to energy or utilities? And we've got people in multifamily buildings don't have access to EV chargers, so they can't buy EVs. We got like both the price of electrical vehicles. So if we're talking about the racial wealth gap, who is likely in a position to purchase an electric vehicle? If we're thinking about home ownership, both racial wealth gap, redlining, like housing affordability and access, like financial discrimination, who has a house that can then afford to put solar panels on the roof. The relationship of race to socioeconomic status. Yeah, I'd probably chalk that up to the racial wealth gap. But really what we're trying to underscore here is the idea that racism has disparate impacts across multiple institutions, and it can start even from education. So if there's segregated school and education, the quality of education is not the same, which impacts the chances of getting into college, which impacts your employability. Then there's like racial discrimination from hiring managers, which we talked about being the intersection of that interpersonal and institutional. And then if you don't get the good job, you make less money. And then there's like historically, aggregating wealth, generational wealth is more concentrated in white communities than communities of color. And so we see like the compounding effects of all of this. And just to drive the point home, it just involves multiple institutions, and it produces barriers to opportunity and racial disparities. So we have here some strategies. Let me maybe pause there. Do we have any questions about those 4 levels? We've got the individual, which is internalized and interpersonal. And then we have the systemic, which is the institutional and the structural. Any questions, concerns? Tony, anything you want to underpin before we?
Dan, and then I'll let you pick right back up.
Okay, you froze for a sec.
Yeah,
I heard you say
stop?
then.
Yeah, can you stop sharing for a second?
Yes.
I want to bring everybody into a community circle here. All right. Hey, everyone. So you got your best Thursday look on. I can appreciate that. So I want to ask you all, just by show of hands, I promise y'all, this is not a trick question.
Okay, so resuming as some of the strategies to address racism. So for internalized racism, support groups, racial healing, mentoring, counseling, and education. Interpersonal racism, we'd suggest diversity training, cross-cultural dialogues. Dinners are an easy access point for folks that are kind of like new to the cross-cultural space. Food is typically a low stakes topic, and people are willing to try it out. And then really the bread and butter of affecting long-term lasting change is at this institutional and structural level. So that's changing policies and practices, creating new institutions. Sometimes we talk about cinnamon raisin bread as we've used a lot of analogies today. But Tony talked about the magic pill. So if you have a racist that's leading an organization, you can give them a magic pill, and it eliminates the racism for that person. Is that enough to create the conditions for racial equity? And what we would talk about is like this analogy of cinnamon raisin bread. It's like who likes cinnamon raisin bread, and what do you like about it? And somebody inevitably doesn't like the raisins. And so the raisins you can pick out of the cinnamon raisin bread, but you can't pick out the cinnamon. And so that is where we want our racial equity strategies and policies baked in, is it's something that you can't take out of the system once you have it in there. All right. And so norming around like data disaggregation by race and um, and other sorts of policies and practices. And then this structural racism and one of the, I'm going to get it wrong, but one of the learning objectives for today was like, how do we, oh, what did it say? How do we think about, shoot, sorry, Al. It was something along the lines of like learning, what we can do locally. So what are our choice points about how we, advance racial equity within government? And one of the things that we at Race Forward advocate for is like a root cause analysis. So not just looking at, this program, what are the outputs and how do we disaggregate that by race, but like what are all of the factors that inform and result in that reality for folks, which can, be looking at like, the program itself. It could be looking at the economic conditions. It could be looking at zip codes, historic redlining, all of those other things. And then history as well. So structural racism, we're looking at challenging racist myths and ideologies. We're talking about narrative and culture change, and then thinking about not just race across one institution, but thinking about like how does this intersect with other government programs, with other institutions, and intersectional impacts. Thank you, Julia. Appreciate that. So, yeah, shared understanding of definitions and concepts, essentially normalizing and promoting institutional and systemic racial equity. So it's that second portion there, the promoting institutional and systemic racial equity. Like we could do another, 8-hour training just on like the approaches for that and different tools that are available. So some key takeaways of the different levels of racism. This framework is intended to help us acknowledge and distinguish the various types of racism that operate and interact simultaneously. It reveals how individual racism is often a symptom of racist systems. So just like Tony again mentioned early on, like, when people are raised here or brought here, we're indoctrinated, we're acculturated to specific ways of thinking and culture. And that trade-off of, when we talk about, trading cultural identity for the assimilation towards whiteness, that's a symptom of a racist system. So strategies focused only on changing individuals are not sufficient for dismantling structural racism. And I want to double click. It's not saying that they're not helpful, not constructive, right? They're still compelling, valid, and like it matters to do that work. But so it's necessary but not sufficient is what I would say there. And then this points us towards systems change strategies which address root causes and result in more transformative and lasting change. And so we are coming up at time. Maybe we'll put these questions to the group. Is there an aha moment that came up for you today? And can you think of an example in your work where some of these concepts may apply?